Okay, I guess we will begin our next session. That's going to be session E. That's going to feature Toni Jensen and Elizabeth Dodd, and I'll introduce both of them now and then let them trade off. So Toni Jensen is the author of Carrie, a memoir and essays about gun violence and American land, forthcoming from Ballantine. Her essays and stories have been published in journals such as Orion, Catapult, and Ecotone, and have been anthologized widely. Her story collection, From the Hilltop, was published through the Native Storiers series at University of Nebraska Press. She teaches in the programs of creative writing and translation at the University of Arkansas and in the low residency MFA at the Institute of American Indian Arts. She is Métis. Then Elizabeth Dodd teaches creative writing and environmental literature at Kansas State University. She's the author of 6 books, most recently Horizons Lens and In the Mind's Eye, which was the Best Book Award winner from the Association for the Study of Literature and Environment. She is the nonfiction editor at terrain.org.
Thanks to everyone for coming. I am going to read the title essay from my forthcoming book, Carrie. Stephen, did you hear me read this at IA? Yes. Okay, sorry. I think it might be new to some of the rest of you. I've not read it here. And I'll just go ahead and get started. It's a segmented essay, so it's got numbers. I think that's about all you'll need to know. Carrie. 1. In the memorial garden, my colleague Michael Heffernan bends to tend some short, once green plants that to my untrained eyes remain mysterious. He's quiet and pours the water with care. He is so quiet. In this, the first week of classes, my first on this campus, I don't yet know Michael well, but already I know quiet to be for him the most unnatural of states. The moment before, I was sitting in my office near his in our building, Kimple Hall, and he was trying to exit the door next to my office, his hands filled with water glasses. I said, "Thirsty?" And he said, "Do you know about the garden?" When I shook my head, he nodded toward the window to a grassy patch, and I had work to do, new names to memorize, grading to finish already. Another colleague had just been in my office too, talking about a female graduate student, describing her as, quote, a bag of snakes. At first, I'd misunderstood. She has a bag of snakes, I said, in the building? On the topic of snakes, I'm surprisingly neutral. But if this student kept her snakes, say, in her office down the hall, I felt I perhaps should be prepared. No, said the colleague. She is a bag of snakes. And when I presented to him my blank-faced silence, he waved his hands around in my doorway as if clearing a swarm of bees and took himself back down the hall. I understood him fine, of course. He was trying to tell me the student is difficult, is trouble, to be avoided. But the phrase, bag of snakes, and his casual delivery made me want to defend her. I thought, if this is how her faculty are, how brave she must be to have brought with her only one bag of snakes. I thought she needs to go home on the weekend and collect the other 3 bags. So when Michael holds out his water glasses, says garden, I'm still thinking snakes and more snakes, and now I'm thinking Arkansas Bible Belt strangeness, and I don't want to follow, I don't. But Michael is more than 70 years old, and how will he open the door with glasses of water in both hands? So I take one of the glasses, I follow. In the garden, after the careful tending of the plants, Michael tells me about his friend, John Locke, who was killed in our building on this campus, the University of Arkansas, on the first day of classes in fall 2000. The memorial garden, like me, is new to campus in fall 2010. After the tending, Michael and I sit on a concrete bench, the August sun heating the concrete heating the backs of my legs. he tells me about his friend's life as a father, as a professor of comparative literature for 33 years, as a teller of elaborate jokes, as a mentor. He could listen, Michael says. He heard you. Michael's eyes are wet behind his glasses, and we sit across from the memorial grass, the memorial koi pond, the small plaque. We sit like that, the sun on our heads, the concrete warming my legs, until Michael nods and pats me on the arm, and we head back inside, each of us carrying a water glass emptied. After, I learn more details. A grad student about to be expelled from the program shot John Locke in his office, and then, a few minutes later, shot and killed himself. In the faculty vote on the student's expulsion, John Locke had been the only person to abstain, the student's only supporter. John Locke's office was Kimpel 231, and my new office is Kimpel 221. This year, in spring 2018, in the first week of classes, according to new law, anyone who's licensed can come to Kimpel Hall carrying a handgun, to my office to Kimpel 221 carrying a handgun, to my classroom carrying a handgun. Similar laws exist in 9 other states as well, affecting thousands of campuses, hundreds of thousands of students, faculty, and staff. But on this, the campus that is supposed to be mine, I'm supposed to be concerned with the mine, with the now. As Americans, we're all supposed to be concerned with the now over the past, with the mine over the ours. So to consider the mine, the now, anyone with a license now can carry his gun and sit to warm himself on the concrete bench. Anyone with a license can look out with his hand on his handgun and enjoy the memorial garden. 2. Most of the great state of Arkansas was once Quapaw land, but the northwest corner where I reside, including the town Fayetteville and the university campus, was Osage territory, not formally ceded until 1818. This particular patch of territory had long been contested, first between the Osage and Quapaw, then between the Osage and Cherokee. So the earning of it had been hard fought, hard won. The eventual ceding of this territory to the United States government, of course, happened at the sharp point of the bayonet, or down the wide barrel of the earliest muskets and long arms, known as Northwest guns, Mackinaws, Fusils or Fusees, or Hudson's Bay Fuchs. The southern border of this space we call campus, the University of Arkansas campus, is now called Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, but was once known best as the Trail of Tears. From the Library of Congress to Wikipedia, through the history books in between, the language describing removal is a study in power dynamics. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act and began the era of removal of the 5 southeastern tribes from their homelands to reservation land in Oklahoma. The Choctaw were removed in 1831. The Seminole were removed in 1832. The Creek were removed in 1834. The Chickasaw were removed in 1837. The Cherokee were removed in 1838. Note in this, the language of the official record, how Jackson is the only one assigned an action, albeit a polite action. He signs, he begins. Note how passive is the language of removal. Were removed, were removed, were removed. Note the absence of guns from the official record, official narrative. There is no mention, for example, of the 7,000 United States soldiers who arrived in Cherokee territory in the 1830s, who forced the removal of thousands of Cherokee people. There is no mention how sharp the points of the soldiers' bayonets. According to Webster's, the first known use of the word campus occurs in 1774. Definitions include 1, the grounds and buildings of a university, college, or school. 2, a university, college, or school viewed as an academic, social, or spiritual entity. And 3, grounds that resemble a campus, a hospital, a landscape corporate campus. In 2017, there are 10 states that allow guns on school campuses: Arkansas, Colorado, Georgia, Idaho, Kansas, Mississippi, Oregon, Texas, Utah, and Wisconsin. Though there are competing narratives about motives and means, All agree the Campus Carry movement begins after the shootings at Virginia Tech. In a decade, the movement grew from one state, Utah, to 10 at roughly the rate or speed of one state added per year. Although the University of Wyoming wouldn't open its doors until 1886, the first remains of the dinosaur, known as Camptosaurus, were found in Wyoming in fall 1879. The Camptosaurus is a plant-eating, beaked dinosaur of the late Jurassic period of western North America and possibly Europe. The name means flexible lizard or flexible-backed lizard. Scientists believe a full-grown Camptosaurus could move at roughly the rate or speed of 15 miles per hour. To study a familiar moment in time, a woman tells someone how she met her husband through a mutual friend at a restaurant, and that someone smiles politely. If the same woman tells that same someone how she met her husband while they were students together on a campus, same someone smiles and sighs and says, "Oh, how nice." Their children will be encouraged to attend this campus, to be that charmed presence universities call legacy. Their children and their children's children and on. Oh, how nice. To study the tangled history of this space considered campus is to study the sigh, the smile, the oh, how nice. To study the tangled, contested history of this space considered campus is to enter into a deep conversation about why some places and spaces are considered hallowed when they are in fact stolen. 3. I'm teaching in Pittsburgh at Chatham College in 2007 at my first tenure track job when a college senior at Virginia Tech, an English major, brings his guns to campus and begins shooting. My friend Mimi is an MFA student, a teaching assistant at Virginia Tech. I have a newborn daughter. I am the godmother of Mimi's son, Daniel. That morning, as the news blares from the living room television, I walk circles around my dining room table because this is a thing my daughters like. The room my daughter likes, not daughters, just the one. A thing my daughter likes. The room holds stained glass windows, red, green, and gold patterned, and my daughter likes to follow the patterns they make on the hardwood floor, the wall, the table. So I walk and rock her, and she follows the patterns, and in between, I dial Mimi's number, and I dial and I dial. I get busy signals. I get her cheerful voice recorded. I get more busy, more signal. It's late afternoon when I hear her voice, when I learn that Mimi has been in lockdown, one building over from Norris Hall, the main site of the shooting. It's late afternoon when I learn she has spent her morning hearing shots, instructing her students not in the art of narrative forms, but in how to get down and stay down, and how to remain so very quiet. In Pittsburgh, in the later afternoon, in my rental house, the light through the stained glass casts lovely, colorful shadows onto the hardwood. It's time to go to work, so I hand my daughter off to her father and leave the light to them. Pittsburgh lies about 300 miles north of Blacksburg at Virginia Tech by car. If the crow is flying, the distance is shorter. It includes the hills known as the Allegheny Mountains, which were long home to the Shawnee and to the Cherokee before removal. I don't drive to Blacksburg, though this is my impulse. Instead, I drive across Pittsburgh, its rivers and bridges, its hills and hollows, to the campus I'm supposed to consider mine. To my graduate fiction class that night, I bring my wrecked face, my hair caked with baby spit, and my talk on the art of narrative forms. A student, Amy Fair, sits among the group. Teachers are not supposed to have favorites, but in this private school space, on this private school campus, I do. Amy's from West Virginia, is tattooed, and swears like it's as necessary as breathing. She's not from money either, or even from the middle class, and therefore she is as rare a creature on this campus as would be a Camptosaurus. She has brought the right amount of snakes. Back in the fall semester, at the end of my pregnancy, when I had to miss a few classes to stay home and lie on my left side, Amy organized and co-led one workshop in my absence. Already, after one prior bed rest episode, some students were complaining about my absence. Why, they wondered to the program administrator, can I not work right up until my due date? Why was I not there for them? When I asked Amy to sub for me on what would be my second absence, she said, "Some of these bitches are going to hate that. Do you care?" "No," I said, "I trust you." "Good," she said, "perfect. Fuck those complaining bitches anyway." Both our faces stretched wide a second before we looked away, before we examined with care the tops of our shoes. 8 years later, in fall 2015, during the first week of that quarter's classes, when a student brings his guns to Umpqua Community College in Oregon, Amy is teaching an English class in that building in Snyder Hall. She has just returned from a sabbatical. She's working on a book about the history of tattooed women. Roseburg, Oregon, and the surrounding area are and were the territory of the Cow Creek Band of the Umpqua tribe, whose tribal headquarters are in Roseburg. The 100 acres of the college campus is land taken from the Umpqua. That fall day, 2015, the shooting begins in the room next door to Amy's classroom. One of her students in the front row is an Army veteran, Chris Mintz, who blocks the shared door between the classrooms with his body. Amy leads students, quiet, so quiet, out of Snyder Hall in one direction. Chris leads students out the other way, each of them knocking on doors along the way, quiet, so quiet, with their get-downs, with their follow-me's. After, Chris is rightly valorized and Amy happily ignored because she tells all the reporters to go fuck themselves. Which is to say, each of them lives, though Chris Mintz is shot 5 times helping evacuate fellow students from the campus library, and Amy takes a leave of absence to heal from post-traumatic stress. Each of them lives, but this is not a happy ending. There is no way to gerrymander this narrative into the frame of the simple, the jingoistic, the most American of our narratives. 4. My first campus is the University of South Dakota in Vermilion. Much of the Great Plains, including South Dakota, was and is Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota land. This corner of South Dakota in particular was Yankton Sioux or Dakota land. This word Vermilion in Lakota means the place where the red clay is gathered, all of which to say this campus sits on their land. Before I left my no-stoplight hometown in rural Iowa for this campus, my sister had left for another, larger campus. When she went, she forgot her bag of snakes at home, or maybe she left them for me, knowing I would have a need. She didn't stay at school more than a semester. When it was my turn, the snakes went along, and I was still unprepared, but I stayed. My first college roommate took one look at my father and then started working the phrase "Indians get" into every conversation, every corner of our room. Indians get free computers. Indians get free school. Indians get all the scholarships. You would know this, she said, if you lived West River. In South Dakota parlance, West River means west of the Missouri River, which divides the state east-west, with most of the reservation lands on the western side. She is playing both sides. If I'm Indian, I'm a taker. If I'm not Indian, I should know the Indians are the takers. She is here to give me an education. I give her my blank face. I give her more and more time in the room without me. I give her no answers. On this, my first campus, on my first visit to my faculty advisor to choose my classes, the woman's behind schedule, so I wait in the hall while student after student files into her office. Sometimes this professor flits by, all scarves and long flowing skirts, on her way to fetch more coffee. The students remain in her office. When my turn comes and I go to schedule my classes, creative writing and native literature in which I'm planning to major, the professor comes back to her office with her full cup and says, in a voice not quiet, "Get out." She recovers herself and says, "I need a minute, please wait in the hall." I've been waiting in the hall, and I go back there. From inside the office, there are sounds of shuffling and rifling. When the door reopens and she waves me back in, her purse has been moved to the other side of her desk. "I'm sorry," she says by way of explanation, "but things have been taken lately from people's offices." I sit through my advising session very carefully, my file in front of her, which includes my demographics. I think of my friend from Pine Ridge who's scheduled to come to this office the next day, and if this is how I'm treated with my light skin and blue eyes, how is it going to be for her? I'm thinking how I'll tell her the story, the scarves, the skirts, the crazy eyes. I'm thinking that we'll laugh, and so I sit in the chair but remain unadvised. The next semester, I get a new roommate and a new advisor, and the roommate is fine, and the second advisor, instead of proffering advice, offers his hand on my knee, his traveling hand, and I leave the building again unadvised and go back to my room to tend my snakes. I'm attending this campus on a scholarship, and to keep this scholarship, I work at the university paper. The advisor is a woman who swears and paces, and I love her and fear her in equal measure, until the day she trusts me with the story of her son, a grown man accused of sexual assault in Nebraska. He has to go to court, she says. It's such bullshit. He wouldn't do that. At a party, a half block off campus, this man, the son of my advisor, drinks and drinks. One night, just before this conversation, I'm there drinking and drinking. The house belongs to a good friend who falls asleep, and this man, we'll call him Doug, chases me around and around the futon couch like we're playing some terrible game of duck, duck, goose. There are no snakes present, no Camptosaurus, and my friend is asleep, is snoring from his recliner, and where have all the other people gone? The way I get away from Doug is because I'm small. The futon has a large wooden frame, and there are meant to be soft, comfortable pillows on the back, but they are absent, and I make use of their absence, which is to say I've lost the game of duck, duck, goose. I'm on the futon with Doug, and I only get to leave because the pillows are missing, and I wiggle out the gap and shake awake my friend, who walks me home to my apartment just off this place considered campus. My snakes are waiting, and I think perhaps I will, this day forward, carry them with me in that space we call always. The next week, I learn Doug will be acquitted on all charges in Nebraska. The next week, I learn he raped one of my friends at another party. I don't tell my newspaper advisor. She's in charge of my scholarship. She's happy her son is acquitted. Later that year, when he's going through his 12 steps, Doug follows me around town apologizing. At the bookstore, apology. At the bar, apology. At the diner, apology. I tell him to move on to his next step without my forgiveness. I tell him I work the police beat now at the paper, and I mention statute of limitations. And he goes quiet, so quiet, and he moves on to the next step or does not, but he stops enacting the act we call apology. This story is an ordinary, everyday violence story from a space considered campus. It is hard to see this space as hallowed when it is filled with so much ordinary, everyday violence. It is hard to see this space, this campus, as mine when it so clearly is not, when it so clearly never was. It's hard not to ask the question, who benefits from having an armed presence on a place considered campus? It's hard not to answer it with the negative, with the absence. Not the girls who become women while they tend their snakes. They are waiting in the campus halls for someone to offer advice. They are waiting still. Thank you.
How many people have gone through ALICE training in this room? Have gone through ALICE training, surviving active shooter training. My essay today is called, it's How to Survive Active Shooting, what you do. My essay is called Outliers, and I'm going to be talking about, reading about the Pueblo community that exists the farthest east and north in the southwest of the United States. It's called El Cartalejo, and it's in Kansas. Pueblo peoples of Taos, Laguna, Jemez, and their ancestors from the ancient Puebloan places like Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon, and the outlier communities of that time period like Chimney Rock and Hovenweep are the people who are behind this essay. It's a work in progress, and so it's going in different places, and maybe we'll have some time for questions at the end that can come out. Outliers. The high plains of western Kansas are famously flat, so much so that several years ago a group of geographers, irreverent graduate students, I think, took an IHOP pancake back to campus and using something called a confocal laser microscope, measured the macro pancake topography, compared it to the USGS digital elevation model of Kansas topography, and determined, and I quote them precisely, that the degree of flatness for my state might be described mathematically as damn flat. Still, there are pockets of difference. A few sedimentary spires and outcrops rise like pale versions of hoodoos from Utah. And the headwaters of one particularly lovely creek, Ladder Creek, lie in the flattest part of eastern Colorado, and the waterway meanders and twists, flowing into Kansas with sudden doglegs like a gerrymandered congressional district. You can be moving along past uncut lines of corn in their regimented standstill, or skimming past the buzz stubble of a wheat field already harvested, and then suddenly you're at the rim, looking down at a crenellated canyonland. It looks like New Mexico, a friend of mine says, when I say I want to go there to camp. It does. And it's the place where at least one, probably two, and maybe more groups of emigrants from the ancient pueblos along the Rio Grande went to escape Spanish colonial tyranny more than 200 years ago. There's so much history and nuance underneath and behind the horizontal, tabular aspect. And who doesn't love a story of a human outpost, a holdout, a last bastion beyond the reach of distant power? In this story, the written record appears in fragments. In the 18th century, Franciscan priest Silvestre Velez de Escalante, famous for his journey through the West in the year 1776, and memorialized in the National Monument, which even after whittling away by the Trump administration, still bears his name, Fray Escalante recounted stories from the 1600s. In the middle of the last century, he wrote, some families of Christian Indians of the nation and pueblo of Taos rebelled, withdrew to the Buffalo Plains, and fortified themselves at a place which afterwards, on this account, was called El Cartalejo. By those 1600s, the Spaniards had figured out they weren't going to be able to loot whole cities of gold in what is today the American Southwest, and it would be centuries more before the frackable wealth underground would be discovered. So the primary pretext for their occupation was to minister to the indigenous, embedding Franciscan missions in the heart of each pueblo, and not infrequently calling on the military to forcibly pacify the Indians' resistance to those ministrations. Thereby, of course, the Spanish were also sticking it to the French. Thereby, too, they were comforting the younger Spanish sons, those resentful left-outs and also-rans chafing under their non-inheritance of patriarchal wealth through primogeniture. Here was a way to allow these not privileged enough men to have their ships come in that land of dry rivers. Encomienda, the slavery system the conquerors dragged along with them from their bloody crusades across the sea, allowed the encomendero and his descendants to pry out wealth of a sort, labor or tribute, from the surrounding nations they had invaded. This gave rise to the administrator class, dedicated to striking it rich or richer through their seats of government in the New World. Somehow, I had always thought vaguely encomienda, the word, derived from comer, to eat, dressing the practice in Anglo-style Thanksgiving decoration, maize and beans and ubiquitous turkeys. But that's not so. The irony is bedrock deep. It actually comes from the AR verb, to trust, encomendar. Note the adjective in Fray Escalante's account above, the Christian Indians. Part of the deal of encomienda was winning souls for God through instruction and conversion to the Catholic faith. So much winning. Thus, protection of what Christian tribute the Indians owed to God was much of that with which the encomendero was supposed to be entrusted. But back to Kansas and El Cartalejo. That name is often said to be a mashup of cuarto, room, and lejos, distant. But one scholar I read, a recent translator of the 18th century texts, has a different view. Cuartel is a fortified place or outpost or barracks, he says. The ejo suffix usually should be translated as a pejorative diminutive, especially in colonial or Old Spanish. For example, lugarejo, lugar, meaning place or town, when given the ejo suffix, can be translated as a podunk town. He continues, I translate El Cartalejo as stinking little fort. It's okay to laugh. And there's Trump in here too. It's okay to laugh at those moments. In the middle of the 1600s, resistance to the Franciscans peppered the Rio Grande Valley, and the priests stepped up with punishments, some of them creative in their brutality. Friars at Zuni, Taos, Jemez, and Hopi were killed, and the Puebloans withdrew to the traditional refuge locations the people had relied on in times of intertribal war, the high buttes of Corn Mountain, Old Cotitlí, and Black Mesa, for example. By 1639 or 1640, the Spanish thug lords were particularly energetic in hanging men from Jemez Pueblo, claiming they had collaborated with Apache and Navajo enemies of the Spaniards. It was a good time for people to leave their homes for sanctuary in the north. In Taos, too, the depraved depredations of the resident priest incited a revolt, followed by an exodus to someplace safer. Those refugees left the territory of New Mexico altogether, traveling some 300 miles from their ancestral mountains and buttes, canyons and arroyos. Yet the caravan of emigrants fleeing to the north and the east would have known exactly where they were headed. In that part of the world, permanent water are both painterly beautiful and cartographically renowned sources, and they would have been a clear destination on any traveler's map. The migrants settled along the banks of a stream that still flows year-round, even after decades of aquifer mining, center pivot irrigation in the high plains. 19th century Euro-American immigrants called the waterway Beaver Creek or Ladder Creek. I have no idea what name it held in other languages throughout the centuries prior. Apache people already lived there, but the two groups had economic ties, including their cooperative acquisition throughout the 1600s of Spanish horses. The trading partners settled into a social life together. Centuries later, the contemporaneous Apaches' teepee rings and roasting pits still lay less than 100 yards from the stone and adobe ruins of the Pueblo. Many of that first wave of refugees were captured and dragged back to New Mexico by one Capitan Juan de Archuleta, probably in 1642 or 43. But some of the emigrants from Taos escaped and stayed on. Later, people from Piquerí Pueblo lit out for El Cartalejo too. This part of the story emerges from the 1690s, the decade after the Pan Pueblo revolt planned by a shaman named Pope with heavy involvement from people from the Tiwa pueblos of Taos and Picaree. The revolt's success had resulted in a dozen years of freedom from genocide and economic austerity for the Puebloan people. A dozen years, and then Governor Diego de Vargas returned from the South. Through threat, followed by acquiescence, and then by terrorism and execution, Vargas relaunched his conquest of that portion of New Spain. Once again, people from the northern pueblos fled the violence at home, taking refuge in the little fort on the Buffalo Plains. I've been trying hard to take heart these days about pockets of resistance and refuge. Kansas is politically hopeless, a friend sneers, and I launched offensively into a short list of evidence to the contrary in the 2016 election, even while the state joined the wave of communal insanity that swept Trump through the rusted canal locks of the Electoral College and into the White House. We kicked out some of the most egregious vandals of the common good in our state legislature. They were people who had colluded with Governor Brownback to destroy the public schools they were entrusted to provide for, instead launching tax cuts that eliminated taxes altogether for hundreds of thousands of businesses, including individuals claiming to essentially be businesses. Then in 2018, in the gubernatorial race, we declined to enshrine Chris Kobach, the heir apparent for this Kansas experiment, who as Secretary of State had reveled in his role of consultant general to xenophobes nationwide, crafting anti-immigration local ordinances and policies to suppress the vote. Also in 2018, we elected Sharice Davids, the first openly LGBT Native American elected to Congress, the first openly gay congressional representative from Kansas, and one of the first 2 Native women elected to Congress, period. So I don't believe that Kansas is politically hopeless, and I keep looking for well springs of hope, reservoirs of resistance that disrupt the currents of authoritarian kleptocracy and recreational sadism awash in the country. I've taken El Cartalejo as a mythic symbol, looking to the western Kansas pockets of canyonlands for intimations of invincibility. And I have been trying to get outside as often as I can to take consolation and maybe fortitude from the still so much more than human world. The little fort, when excavated by H.T. Martin in 1898, measured 53 by 35 feet and contained 7 rooms, none of which were said to have doors. So archaeologists concluded that all access was through the roof, via ladders that had left telltale post hole marks in the soil. And although Martin and his co-author S.W. Williston insisted the proper name for the nearby stream was Beaver Creek, not Ladder Creek, it is the latter name that locals used and which persists on contemporary maps. The creek is said to have been so called because Euro-American immigrants to the territory, a little more than a century after the fort's abandonment, found submerged in the current an old wooden ladder made of sticks, rungs bound to posts by strips of leather. Perhaps no stream in the western part of the state offers more favorable conditions. In the driest years, there is always an abundance of water in the stream, and in the deep pools along its course, there are always many fish, wrote my turn-of-the-century sources, Martin and Williston. In fact, an artesian spring still springs from the west rim of the canyon. It's known today as the only place in the state where Virginia rails overwinter. The spring ensures there's always open water. My partner has been there in December for a Christmas bird count, a kind of secular citizen scientist pilgrimage in the dark part of the year, and he can testify that it's true. The little fort was positioned, wrote Martin, as duly east and west in its greater measurement as would be possible today to locate it with an ordinary compass. Over the years, I've read a lot about sun watching and the sacred calendar of ancient Puebloan people. I've watched sun and moon rises that align perfectly with the ancient architecture, the multi-story great houses or half-underground kivas. Most of my little pilgrimages to alignment have taken place at the winter solstice, at high enough altitude to make dawn a shivering experience in both asceticism and exhilaration. I've visited rock art sites all over the Southwest, which constellate the places people lived and planted and prayed to the procession of the sun from solstice to solstice. So in my quest for a place-based parable of resistance, I take heart too at the thought of the exiles building in their familiar customs. Not a squalid shelter, not a refugee camp, slapdash lean-tos and tents of despair. They laid out the walls of their distant rooms in calibration with the known cosmos, the sun moving despite whatever catastrophe raged below in its timeless migrations from summer home to winter home. The migrants must have had the time and sense of purpose to turn the architectural practices they'd brought from home towards protecting their cultural institutions. Today, the Pueblo ruins are an unimpressive feature in Scott Lake State Park. Back in the 1920s, Ladder Creek was dammed, and the resulting reservoir is a destination for fishers and swimmers. Equestrian trails meander along the hills below the lower canyon rim. A reconstruction from the 1970s rebuilt the footings of the fort just shin high. A Daughters of the American Revolution obelisk stands nearby as a weird sentry to revolution and ruination. In early September, a few weeks before the equinox, I wanted to layer outrage with possibility. I imagined sunrise on a canyon rim and birdsong through the tangy scent of sumac and cottonwood, like an infusion of stamina for some long haul. Like many states, Kansas has outsourced its parks reservation system to a private company, Reserve America, which is headquartered in Dallas. However, Kansas is unique in requiring park visitors to provide two particular pieces of information while making a reservation. In the virtual online world, you must follow a specific path in order to arrive at the intended destination, where your credit card number will secure your privilege to sojourn, however briefly, in the designated accommodation. There's lots of clicking involved. You can move back and forth between the park's website and that of Reserve America. You can scrutinize the diagram of each campground, wondering about proximity to the vault toilet. You can exit the site to peruse rental gear. Most important to me, of the two cabins in the park, one named Navajo and the other Taos, the latter was actually available for the only night Dave and I might get away. A little box popped up when I clicked to complete the transaction. Missing information, it proclaimed. For this booking, you have to provide the following information. U.S. citizen. Please click yes or no. So you can see what I need to find out next, where I'm going next. Questions? For nice conversation.
Well, I thank both Toni and Elizabeth for coming. I don't know if it's just the end of a long day and people are sitting like this, because these people usually have lots of questions.
Mm-hmm.
They're cogitating.
How do you think
I don't know.
How would we find out?
Oh, I guess we'll have to get Facebook friends, I don't know. I'm corresponding now with a chief of staff of the new governor, the Democratic governor, and have brought this to her attention, and they're looking into it. From what I can tell, this is a policy that dates back to the Brownback administration. The story is that they have to ask this question, and then they ask for your social security number, and then they can check to see if you are listed as a child predator. And this is the way the state of Kansas is choosing to be in compliance with national legislation in identifying child predators by using our national or our state park system. This is what we're choosing to do. So currently, I have nothing to share from my correspondence with the governor's office. That's part of the developmental work of this essay. And I'm going to get there for the winter solstice, and I'm going to spend the night there, and I'm going to watch the sun come up over the rim of that canyon. So those are two things I still have to do.
You can sleep safely knowing there are no child predators
Yeah,
in the campsite.
yeah.
No registered.
Registry.
As you can tell, I was appalled, you know, and it suddenly made me think about refuge and beauty in that place with another whole layer of dread and rage.
I think that as most of us, or many of us are professors there, so I was wondering, have you all had the experiences you've had as a professor in your career, and are you simply more aware that when I think you're talking about types of asymmetry, your experience is different than others in relation to campuses? And to a large, I think that's probably the theme of what you're writing about, how it's asymmetrical. But there has been violence, at least. We hear stories as part of the lore of the campus of sexual harassment and abuse. I just, maybe you can expand a little more. Why do we let it take place?
Yeah, I mean, part of the because this is the title essay for the book that will be out next year, and I mean, that's sort of part of the project of talking about guns, talking about problems we have related to race, problems we have, American problems related to gender. Campuses are, I think, a particularly interesting space. I talk about other places that are not campuses, but most of my working life has been on campuses, not all, but most. So there's a kind of preciousness or like a hallowed ground that we apply to certain spaces. So when they're violated, I think we react more strongly, culturally, narratively. We segregate school shootings out, right? We call them school shootings versus just mass shootings. There's a particular kind of reaction to mass shootings that happen in places of worship or sanctuary. I'm not arguing that's inappropriate or bad or anything, but for me, it's interesting. It's interesting to see the ways that we segregate violence that either make it an amplification or a pushing down. When you say something was an act of domestic violence, right, that's a shushing generally. Whereas if you say it's a mass violence, right, or school shooting versus domestic. I mean, if you have friends who are reporters in newsrooms now, it's absolutely the case when the news comes in that there's been an incident. Where did it happen? School shooting, up, domestic, down, it's not a story. And so I'm trying to tie how we react to and the language surrounding some of these acts of violence. I don't think that my experiences have been particularly asymmetrical or anomalous. I just think that I look at it differently, right? That I'm noticing that maybe there are historic reasons, undercurrents why we view these things the way we do. So, yeah.
Yeah, We have a movement at Sowell, led by our Dean of Arts and Sciences, who's a psychologist. He calls it open care, and it's a play on the open caring idea.
That's nice.
And so he's gotten faculty and students together once a week almost. It's not just, it started with the gun issue.
Right.
It gets people to talk about areas of conflict on the campus and in the town in general. Just it's an encounter group. He's a psychologist. So he's getting people to open up, which relates to your idea of the shushing.
Yeah.
Yeah, what I really appreciated about what you read was that you were bringing attention to these sites as not new sites of violence, but ongoing sites of violence, right?
Yeah.
You're talking about the deep history of indigenous removal, and this is just a new chapter in ongoing states of violence, right? So I think you did that really beautifully. I'm kind of interested in the way that the rest of the book, like what are some of the other places that you
Yeah.
look at?
I do look at Lubbock because I lived here a long time. And Pittsburgh, where I lived, when the year my daughter was born, I taught at Chatham and was given no maternity leave and left. So both Pittsburgh and Lubbock, I think, are interesting because they have statistically high crime rates. And so what's considered, but I don't know that people outside of the regions or the areas they're in know that or think of them in those ways. And so when I first lived in Lubbock, for example, I lived in a house that had been a drug dealer's house before I lived there, and in a neighborhood that had, some of the most violence in Lubbock. And so I write about how, though I had good neighbors in that neighborhood, right, and how the reality of living in a place that's supposed to be violent is very complex. And Pittsburgh, same sort of situation, working at this fancy, Chatham is a very fancy campus, in my opinion, and so old and kind of hallowed fancy place with mostly very moneyed colleagues, and living in a neighborhood where, the next door neighbors got their house gang tagged, the nice old man next door. And so how community forms in those spaces, and how places that statistically have a lot of violence but operate kind of differently in the micro level, right, on the street level. So those are some of the places. I lived in Orlando. That shooting probably at Pulse, that's one of the main reasons I'm writing the book, because for me that was a campus shooting. That's the club where my students went after workshop, So yeah, and I had to call 40 people probably, or Facebook or text, and we had to wait, if you all remember on that one, for the list of names. It was some hard waiting, because people didn't have the same numbers, weren't getting back. And the conversation about that getting politicalized based on ethnicity and sexual orientation so quickly, when for me, it felt like a campus shooting, made me see, I think more than anything, the disparity in how we treat in the press, those sorts of things. So that was a hard essay, yeah.
Well, if there's no more questions, let's thank these two wonderful people.